thank you all so much for being here today for our program. My name is Melissa Laureano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. If you are new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of our nation's capital. I'd like to first take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free public programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Robert Benson Photography, Buyer Blinder Bell, Building Innovation Hub, Edens, EHT Traceries Inc., who are presenting today, KCE Structural Engineers, Quinn Evans, and David Schwartz Architects. So thank you all so much for your dedication to preservation in DC. Before we begin, I also have a couple of notes. So please put your questions into the Q&A box found at the bottom or the top of your screen. We will answer those questions towards the end of the program. And for those of you joining us on Facebook, we will also be monitoring your questions as well. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce you all to today's speakers. Emily Eig is the founder and president of EHT Traceries, a women-owned company incorporated in Maryland and headquartered in Washington, D.C. As the head of Traceries, she combines management of a 15-person firm with her work as an architectural historian and preservation consultant. Her technical knowledge is focused on late 19th and 20th century buildings and the integration of new buildings into historic settings, including historic sites, campuses, and districts. It includes a thorough understanding of current historic preservation issues as well. Her work with federal, state, and local architecture is well known. She has worked in the District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia, New York, Texas, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Illinois, Michigan, and Hawaii. Further, through her role as the head of Traceries since 1989, she has participated in numerous exceptional preservation-related projects around the country. Laura Hughes is an architectural historian and preservation planner with over 32 years of experience with the assessment, treatment, and design of historic resources. As a principal, she directs work on major renovations and adaptive reuse projects for EHT Traceries, including assisting project teams as they navigate agency review processes and compliance with federal and local preservation regulations. Additionally, she uses survey information and historic context to assess eligibility and significance of historic resources. She directs research, prepares extensive building documentation, advises on local and federal preservation reviews, ensures rehabilitation of historic buildings using the Secretary of Interior standards, and advises on the design compatibility of new additions to historic buildings and new construction in historic districts. She also manages the consultation and production of planning documents such as small area plans, historic preservation plans, master plans, and pattern books and design guidelines. Many of Laura's projects combine the low-income housing tax credit with the rehabilitation tax credit, resulting in the preservation of affordable housing and the rehabilitation of important city landmarks, many projects involving DC apartment buildings. So with that, I'm so excited to turn things over to Laura and Emily, and I thank them so much for being here today. And
Thank you.
Thank you. So welcome everyone. As soon as we get our screen going, we are talking to you about apartment buildings of Washington, D.C. and the lessons that we have learned from the DC Apartment Building Survey that was done many years ago. We can go to the next slide and give you some background. Yeah, so Laura and I are going to share this. We're going to do part 1 and part 2, and we may interject information in between, because she and I have worked on this for many years. And as you see from the screen today, right now, this was started in 1985. Laura was a very young thing, and I was not all that much older. But DC Preservation League received a grant, and they awarded that grant to Traceries to undertake this DC apartment building survey. It was an incredibly bold move to address apartment buildings, because we thought there were about 2,000 of them around the city. But Traceries had done some work on database development, and that was going to helped the project dramatically, and it truly did help the project dramatically. It could not have been done without the database. And so this is 1985. We had just come off doing a database for the Calorama Triangle, and that we'll talk about in a minute. We'll tell you about that. And that provided a structure and provided a way to keep, not just keep information, but help us understand what information we needed to understand so that we would have a full and better understanding of what the extent of apartment buildings were, but how many there were, where they were, what they looked like, when they were built, who built them, who designed them, the whole gamut. So we can go to the next slide. So the apartment building survey, as I said, it extended for many years, several years for us to do the work. And we had products that included a computerized listing of all identified extant and demolished apartment buildings. And they were organized because of the database in a very logical way. We had this computer program that was extraordinary for its time, and in fact is one of the best computer programs that we've ever had, even though it was all these many years ago, but it provided an opportunity to do all kinds of reports that helped us analyze the data. It developed, we were able to develop a narrative history of the development of the apartment buildings. We did multiple property nomination, and we actually did 11 individual landmark nominations. We've done more since then, but that initial cut. We had public information, that a report that explained the goals and methodology. We had a brochure that was handed out at the Martin Luther King Library, among other places, that explained what we had done and what we had learned. We had survey forms and computer printouts and photograph of every building, all of which we still have housed at Traceries in their original form. And we had evaluation criteria that was published, and that we're going to talk about a little more later, as well as an extensive bibliography. And all of this was done with a database, but without the internet. And that's really important. Having done research pre-internet and post-internet, it's a remarkably different exercise, and the internet allows us to gather so much more information than we could so much more quickly. But there still is a lot of information that's not on the internet, believe it or not. And there's also a lot of stuff that you just simply have to go out and look at buildings. Always an advocate. I'm always an advocate of looking at buildings, and we looked at every one of these buildings. Important to this, if we can do the next slide, is that we had volunteers from the Preservation League, and the Preservation League volunteers were trained, and they went out and they each looked at buildings all around the city. As you can imagine, it turned out there were closer to 4,000 buildings that we looked at, not 2,000 as we had estimated. And those volunteers were the critical part of it. So the methodology was, as said, to identify apartment buildings from that's our goal, was apartment buildings from the 19th century through the end of World War II. 1880, because we knew when the original apartment building had been built. It was no longer standing, but we knew that. And we did not want to engage in all of the development that happened post-World War II, all the public housing. It would have taken us many, many more years to do that. So we ended it with World War II. Dates they were chosen, they encompassed the introduction of the apartment building through a period of major growth due to the war. We did archival resources that we looked at, and that our research formed the basis of the inventory, as I'll explain in a minute. But as I just said, we expected 2,000 buildings, but there were over 4,000 that were actually in our survey in the end. Next, please. We are going to have a quiz later to see if anybody knows the names of the apartment buildings that we're showing. No, just kidding. This is the Bachelor apartment building on I Street. That was an early landmark before we actually did the apartment building survey. So between November of 85 and October of 87, phase one, we identified the buildings, we developed a criteria, and we did a synthesis of the inventory data so that we could develop a conceptual framework. And what that meant was that we said, well, we entered this data that we said, well, how many buildings did Waddy Wood do? How many buildings did George Stantmeyer do? And we were able to get that. When were these buildings built? What was the age? What was our bell curve of development? And all of that was possible because the inventory data through the computers allowed us to understand very quickly where things were. In phase 2, we assessed buildings against the evaluation criteria. We wrote our narrative history. We nominated the buildings, and the HPRB approved those nominations and forwarded them to the register, and we disseminated information. So you can see there was like the collection of data, and then there was the evaluation of this data. Next, please. I don't have it. Do you have it?
Yeah,
Okay.
it
right,
must
so I'm
just be
just
taking a little
running
while for you.
Yes, it's running slow. Okay, so when we had challenges, which is that there was no list of apartment buildings, and we didn't even know what it meant to be an apartment building. We had to come up with a definition. And we didn't know how many different kinds of apartment buildings there really were. We actually didn't know until we started looking at them. They were apartments, they were flats, they were tenements, boarding houses. What did these mean? And also, in certain places, those terms meant something, like in DC versus New York. They had different meanings. So we began with the wildest possible list of buildings, and we eliminated them as things became clearer. We used the Lusk Washington Apartment Directory, and maps were major assistance in that process. So next, I'll tell the story of the Lusk directory, though, while we switch slides, is that one of our clients owned several apartment buildings in the city, and he had this old Lusk directory, and he showed up at our office one day and just said, well, here, this might help you. And it was the list of apartment buildings in the city. And that was like huge. We finally had something where people had written down what they were. They had by street. It gave us information of the number of stories, how many units there were within each story, their square footage, what lot and square they were on, and the value that they were. Some of the owners' names, obviously, and it was extremely helpful to us because we had something that we could actually start entering data about, and we could figure out, let's go see on Chapin Street if those buildings still are there and what do they look like. So it gave us a lot of great structure. All right, next. Okay. Let's see. Do I get deducted my time for taking too long here? Maps, as you can see, this is an interesting map because it shows the Gladstone and the Haywarden, which turned out to be the first time an architect had used the same building design twice. They had never been anything but unique designs. And here there was a twin building. And that idea became popular and resulted in things like garden apartments, where you could just replicate again and again the same design, but absolutely unheard of until these were built. Okay, next. I'm going to have you switch faster and then I will catch up. I think that will be the way to do it. So we did our verification. We did the windshield survey. We had the buildings, as I said, in Lusk. We found more buildings from maps, and then we found more buildings through permit and other research. Not every building was in those two places. One, because some of them had been demolished. They, as we said, over 90 volunteers were recruited and worked on this project. And it was, even my husband volunteered. He did the really tough neighborhoods at like 6 o'clock in the morning because he likes to wake up early, and he made me come. So that was, I was there at these various, these places. So I did get to do survey work as well. All right, next. So we did a survey form that was developed. It was not electronic yet. Like, we didn't have iPads that we could enter onto our survey. Everything was done by hand. And we had people turned in these survey forms with this information. And as you can see, it was, 4 pages of information that they had to fill out. And then they got to put their own comments on it. And that all of that information was put into the computer by Laura Hughes. She got to do that work. And she did a great job, a really great job. So next. Okay, so Larry Carr, unfortunately, died far too young. He was our mentor and the creator of this. I say mentor because he guided us about how to use database information, but he also he did the programming. And he had done when we did Calorama Triangle, we're looking for volunteers at one of our public meetings, and he raised his hand. He says, "Do you have any use for a computer database?" And I was like, "Really?" Because computer databases were very, very, very new at the time. And I said, "Okay, sure." And so he came out and he put together for Calorama Triangle a database that had 5 fields of information, and that was it. It was the address, the year built, the owner, the architect, and something else. There was 5 of them. And what happened is when I was writing the Calorama Triangle Historic District Statement, the Statement of Significance and Description, that's when actually Laura printed the reports on that. And I looked at them and I found 18 pieces of information that had not even occurred to me before I saw the database. And I was able to take that and expand my historic district statement quite dramatically and very effectively. It was so useful, just 5 pieces of information. So I knew that this was a great thing. And we made a partnership with Larry and went on to do all kinds of work with him. And unfortunately, as I said, he died far too young, and Windows had come into place and we were about to switch things into Windows. We just got some work into that, but that was what was an advancement for the rest of the world. For us was not an advancement because we had to take that whole database and switch it over to a new program, which was not fun for Larry, but he did it. So that was really good. And it's a great database. It's unfortunately, he's not here to keep improving it, but he said we had a paper filing system as well. And we organized it by quadrant, whether the building was extant, whether the building was purpose-built as an apartment building. And purpose-built became really important in our discussions of apartment buildings because there were a lot of buildings that became apartment buildings after the fact. And that was not really what we were looking at. We wanted to see buildings that were built with the intention of being a multifamily residence. All the photos that were taken were developed and we attached the survey sheets. You guys have no idea how much easier, you have your iPhone, you take a picture and it goes digitally, but getting film developed, organizing the negatives, very time consuming, very expensive to do. And that was a major part of the survey effort because we could not put a photograph at that time onto our database. The computers didn't take photos, they didn't take maps, they didn't take images like that. So the map had to be added to that. And we Xeroxed, or as we called it then, we photocopied maps so we could do that. We did drawings, and then we did more archival research where we had more information that we could follow up on. So next. So I think if we moved into here, the database used to develop patterns and trends. And as you can see, we had address, building name, we had squares and lots, we had the stories, the number of units. We took a lot of that from the database that was in Lusk, just as our basic thing. But it started us thinking about, well, did we have an apartment building that was in what we thought of as an apartment building, or was it something that looked like a house that was actually built as an apartment building, but looked like it was a house on the street? And we started to realize that purpose-built apartment buildings came in many, many different forms. And so we had to devise an idea of really what was a row house versus a townhouse, because they're different. And these kind of very specific things. We had to make sure we had the quadrant. Everyone just to say, oh, it's on Connecticut Avenue. It's like, well, is that Connecticut Avenue Northwest? Well, there isn't a Connecticut Avenue in any other, but there are lots of streets that do have in both ways. So, and then the question is this the most advanced survey that Traceries did at the time? By far, yes, it is. In terms of numbers, yes. In terms of analysis, no. We've gotten more complex since then. But in terms of numbers, to quantify this many apartment buildings, this many buildings was a big feat. It was a big feat then. It would be a big feat today to actually put 4,000 data resources onto the computer. So let's go to the next one. So our additional research, we went to the library. The Washingtoniana Room was an incredible source. The Historical Society was an incredible source. The Library of Congress turned out to be an incredible source. And while we were doing that, this whole project, James Good, who some of you may remember for having done books like Best Addresses, was putting together that book. And it was a century of Washington's distinguished apartment houses. His criteria was buildings that were really grand and beautiful. He did not have to do the kind of detail that we, had to go and just finding things. He got to be more subjective in his selection, but it was a beautiful and is a beautiful book. And if you can find it, it's really great to have. And he had plans drawn for all these buildings, and it was extremely helpful to us. And we like to think we were also helpful to him in our survey work. So next, please. We're coming here. I obviously had a computer guy. I had a computer guy here just before this started, and it's too bad he didn't stay. He could have maybe helped my speed here a little bit. So what is the next slide here? Okay, the development of criteria. So there are three, the National Register has criteria A, B, C, D. And DC has similar criteria, though they have more letters than that. But these are not very well elaborated upon. And we needed to have some way to evaluate that was much more specific. So we came up with this idea of taking each criteria and breaking it down. Well, what could fit into that criteria? And we took the criteria and we then were able to assess each building. We didn't assess whether it was extremely significant. We assessed it on the most basic level because we wanted to be broad to start with. We didn't want the computer to, we didn't have enough information to make it a really true analysis at that point. But I'll use the one that says at the bottom of the screen, form corridors or zones that illustrate critical changing in zoning and planning trends. So you could see, we discovered that in 1920s, the Zoning Commission decided that apartment buildings should be in certain places. And they had these areas, their corridors. And so buildings that were in those corridors fell into criteria A, as criterion A as being possibly significant for that. Buildings that reflected attitudes about stratification or segregation. Was it a building built for African-American, Black people? Was it for white people? Was it events that anything that happened that was important? And we said, as you know, A is more about social changes and attitudes. It's not about architecture, but social changes in architecture go hand in hand often. So if you have garden apartments or low-cost housing complexes or affordable housing, as we call it today, commercial residential combinations, those tell you about society. So they fall under A as well as possibly under C. So next slide. I know it's going to say about B. And what's about B? And then you can go flip 2 slides, Melissa. But B is one that is about people. And the National Register is very, very strict about it. The building has to be the only building associated with that person and the most important building associated with that person. We might have other buildings that, like we have Woodrow Wilson's birthplace and we have his house in Sheridan, Kalorama, but not both of them can be listed under B because there are 2 of them. And so they argued with me. I had a big discussion of that, trying to make sure that we were doing that correctly. And there are very few apartment buildings that manage to be under B, but there are some. C is, of course, architecture. And that was a field day because the whole thing about illustrating significant types of multiple unit buildings, illustrate significant expressions of style, which might have been rare or influential, illustrating aesthetic movements on their interior plans. Some of them had, well, one of our favorites is the fact is that there are apartment buildings that you walk down into the lobbies, and you walk down in the lobbies for zoning purposes so that they could get more stories, because let's say you could have 6 stories in that area. If you went down with your lobby, it was sort of considered basement, so you could have actually 7 stories. But that would fall into both A and into C. So that was really, a big find to understand there was an actual reason for why. It wasn't just aesthetically they liked it, even though that was an aesthetic change. I have a question here. What was the final definition of apartment building that we used? Well, they're all apartments. They're all apartment buildings. That is the generic overview. And then within them, every apartment building falls into a certain category. And Laura's going to talk about that more. So as this section, we assess these individual buildings. We develop the narrative history. This is all, interesting to talk about, but we can move on. I think it's almost time for Laura's to move up, if I'm not correct, and she'll be faster than I am. Are we there? No, but we did do individual landmark nominations, and each of them had a specific reason for why they were nominated. And how did we get to that? Well, we had given every apartment building, if they met A, B, or C, we gave them a tick, so to speak. We said, this potentially has significance. We didn't say it was significant. We said it potentially had significance. For instance, the Gladstone Hayward potentially might have been the earliest apartment building that was a twin or a triple. And it turned out it was. But at the time, we didn't know. And there were many others that were showing up as identical buildings. So through that effort, we were able to identify, here are 27 that are built as identical buildings. This is the first one. So all of that, the computer database helped us analyze what was important, because we did this sort of overview of significance and then really dug down into what was significant at the end, being a very specific, the first or the most influential, the largest, the this, to that. And they all fit into the criteria. The building, the Kennedy Warren, I believe, was the one that had the most ticks of all. That was the one, it fit like every single category practically. And so it was like the winner of all time. It also had about 20 men who had identified themselves as architects of the Kennedy Warren in their obituaries, which was like, wait a minute, who actually designed the Kennedy Warren? All these people couldn't have been the designer, but everyone in their obituary was the designer. So we've never actually solved it. Well, maybe we did. Did we solve that mystery? I think we did solve the mystery of who was the real, main architect and people who worked on it. So the big thing that came out of all of this was in 1987, the National Register came up with this new idea of the multiple property document. Like, rather than just a historic district, it's buildings that are related, but not geographically necessarily. And that was perfect for our apartment buildings. And this answers the question that we just had about what are the different, what is an apartment building? You can see that there are 11. There were conventional low-rise, conventional mid-rise, conventional high-rise, row house, mansion type, garden apartment, grand garden, house type, commercial residential, luxury apartment, and stacked flats. And my dogs love that one. So these 11 categories became the final analysis. All of those fit into the apartment building definition, but they all are subcategories within that. So this is interesting read, definitely an interesting read. And Laura and I worked on this together. She was now with me full time. And as you know, today she's the H of EHT Traceries. So her work was so critical to helping to get this all together and really making a beautiful project. So now I'm going to pass it over to Laura.
Thank you. So I'm really just going to talk about, and Melissa, you can go to the next slide, just some of the conclusions. And it, as Emily was talking about, there's just was so much data that we had. And it really afforded us the opportunity to break down apartment buildings by types and in relationship to the history of the city and what was happening in the city at the time. And some of the earliest apartment buildings, as Emily mentioned, were built as other things. And that took us quite a while to figure out. Miss Lydia's was a school, and we think that this was one of the first conversions to an apartment building. But the Portner Flats, we identified as the first apartment building in the city, and it certainly has since been demolished, but it was an absolutely beautiful building and fit beautifully within that triangular lot on Vermont Avenue. Next slide. But also really what we learned was that apartment buildings weren't immediately accepted in the district. I think there was a lot of spillover from New York and tenement housing. And so people weren't very quick to embrace apartment living in the city. This Evening Star real estate gossip article is fascinating to us. It was from 1890. And I'll just read a few of the quotes from the article. It says, "It's a surprise to me," remarked a real estate agent the other day, "that there are not more apartment buildings or flats built in the city. There seems to be an opinion that the building of apartment houses will be one of the features of the future development of the city." And if you go to the next slide, I think our research really showed that prior to the turn of the 20th century, there were apartments, but very few apartments. And it was sort of the advent of the 20th century, and this is from 1905, where we really just saw an explosion of apartment buildings. The numbers are staggering. So this was again from an article from the Washington Post. Next slide. And then I just wanted to show one of the questions it asked about the apartment buildings, and what we started to do was really classify them by type. And these are not in chronological order, but so we ended up having public housing, early public housing in the city. There was, sorry. There was a lot more of public housing after 1945, and that's certainly something we'd love to explore. But then Emily mentioned also, there were apartment buildings that look like houses. So we ended up having a mansion type apartment building. There were apartment buildings that really reflected a more of aesthetic of row houses. The slide at the bottom left is one of those. Then we had apartment buildings that looked like townhouses, and the Lafayette, it is an interesting apartment building. It really is one of 13 apartment buildings that remain in the city that were built between 1880 and 1900. So it is incredibly significant, and was one of the original 11 landmark applications we submitted as a result of the survey. And then the middle, my favorite, I wrote my thesis on this architect, the Dresden apartments. We had a whole slew of apartments that were considered luxury apartments. Their amenities, their finishes, the treatments of the lobbies just really were above and beyond all the other apartments in the city. Next slide. And then as we really got into the 20th century in the 1920s and 30s, DC did have garden apartments. Hampshire Gardens is one of the most lovely small scale garden apartments, more similar to those you'll see in Arlington. And Arlington just has hundreds and hundreds of these complexes. But also in Washington, we also had the grand garden apartment complexes like Tilden Gardens up on Connecticut Avenue that were much more large scale, but they too embraced the landscape. And the landscape designs at Tilden Gardens are just amazing. The building on the left at the bottom is the Haywarden, and Emily has spoken about this as one of the early twin apartment buildings. We went on to find at least 7 or 8 buildings in a row, and K. Fritz had named each one after his name. So the first one began with a C, second one was an A, and it was so exciting when we finally figured out that it spelled out K. Fritz. So that was really exciting, but that was a response to an economic need, a real need to have these middle-class apartment buildings that could house a lot of people and could be built economically. And then Emily also mentioned 2929 Connecticut is an excellent example of a response to a zoning requirement. and our height restriction in the city. So to enter, you go down the lobby, and they were then able to get an additional story. Next slide. Sorry, my voice is going. And then also another zoning response. This just shows the construction along the corridors, Connecticut Avenue, 16th Street, 14th Street. And it was fascinating to see just these very clear images of these corridors emerge in the city. And we've often talked about creating corridor historic districts with these apartment buildings because a lot of them have been individually designated as part of rehabilitation tax credit efforts. So next slide. And so, you know, as a result of all of this, you know, this survey has been incredibly useful. We use it on many of our rehabilitation tax credit projects where we combine the low-income housing tax credits. All of these buildings have been rehabbed using the tax credit. So we've been able to designate them because of the information we have from the multiple property document. And certainly we've been using the multiple property document and information from the survey to help individual apartment owners and condominiums as they grapple with restoration and treatment of some of the historic features within their apartment buildings. Next slide. And then finally, really just to sum it up, and what Emily and I would hope that will be able to do in the future is update the historic context and really expand it beyond 1945. Certainly, our research will be a lot easier with the internet, and we have a strong base of information, but we didn't touch the surface of the information about our 1950s and 60s and even 70s now apartment building developments in this city. We really would, as I mentioned, like to explore the corridors as historic districts. And then we've even talked with the DC Historic Preservation Office about documenting DC's public housing after 1945, because that was just a topic we really couldn't tackle as part of the survey. And I think that's our last slide. And we certainly are happy to answer any questions. I kind of was rushing at the end trying to fit it in there.
No, this was wonderful. Thank you both so much. It is incredible to learn about just how much work went into creating this resource, and we thank you for that work. And if there's any volunteers that worked on this in the crowd, thank you as well for your help too. So yeah, let's see if we have any questions. Let's see. So did you use any Sanborn maps for any of the data or locations?
Yeah, we used tons of Sanborn and base maps. That was how we sort of augmented the information we had from the LUST directory. So that was our sort of next step after the LUST directory data. We went to the maps, Sanborn and base maps.
Right.
Those are great. I could get lost in those maps.
We found one time we found, we said there are these buildings and we couldn't find them, and we realized that the map had drawn buildings that actually never got built. They must have had a permit to build, but they didn't build them. So they must have been demolished. It's like, well, no, it turns out they were never built. That was like, wait, the maps can be wrong. It's like, no, the maps can't be wrong, but the maps can be wrong.
That's cool. A cool and confusing find.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Let's see. Do you know if any other city has conducted a similar survey? And sorry if this has been discussed already. They just tuned in. So.
I mean, I think New York has done a lot of work with their apartment buildings. There certainly has been historic context information in New York about apartments. I don't know that they've done such a comprehensive survey.
That's an excellent question. It really is an excellent question.
I mean, we
Yeah.
certainly looked at Chicago and New York for some of our sort of comparison to see what was happening
Right.
in those cities at the same time as DC.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. One of the buildings that is no longer standing is called the Fernando Wood. And we didn't really know who Fernando, what that meant, who it was. And then we realized that he was the mayor of New York. I was like, why would he build an apartment building in Washington? And to be honest, we didn't have enough information or time to search back because it was no longer standing. But I was watching the movie Lincoln, and he's in that movie. He was a congressman. So he was in Washington, and we had found other buildings that had been built by senators, like the senator of Vermont built the Champlain, one of the only two marble-faced buildings in the city, and he owned the Vermont Marble Company also. One of the reasons why there's so many marble buildings in Washington is that man. But people just coming in, so they brought their ideas of what apartment buildings should look like from other places and built them here. Because Washington was a really great real estate market, really great at that time, and just a boom town.
So fascinating.
So I guess we should find out though if there are other cities that have done this survey like this. It'd be really interesting to find out.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get a DCPL volunteer to do that.
Yeah, if any
Just
DCPL
kidding.
volunteers is interested now. Yeah. Well, probably looking myself because that's really interesting. Let's see. Betsy wants to know, is the Lusk directory available online?
I don't know about that. We keep it in an archival box and it's all like falling to pieces. It's like a very precious document for us. So I'm not sure if it's available online. It could be now.
And I should say, John Rutowski was the man, he went by the name of John Ruth, but he was the man, I couldn't remember his name, it's like came to me. He was the one who got us that. I mean, he just found, he said, I have this in my office. Do you want it? It's like, yes, thank you, John. So that was really nice. But
Let's see.
I want to see there's a good question. I have a question here. I'm going to do some research while we're on this.
Good. Judy wants to know, could you tell us more about the Dresden? What were the amenities that were beyond those in other buildings?
I think at the Dresden, it was largely the finishes were just incredible. The apartments were huge. There were some rooftop terraces and balconies. And the lobbies were finished in a really beautiful fashion. And they were also expected that they were gathering places for the residents. And I think at the Dresden, there was a dining room as well, if I remember correctly. So it was just a very lavishly appointed apartment building, and some of the outdoor spaces were beautiful.
Well, and Laura, you should tell me a little bit more about the architect.
Yeah. So Albert Beers designed apartment buildings in Washington from 1905 to his untimely death in 1911. And within that span of time, he designed 124 apartment buildings, mostly for Harry Wardman. And so I believe if he hadn't passed away suddenly, he would have surpassed George Santmeyer's in production of apartment buildings. And many of them were sort of modest, medium-sized apartment buildings that Wardman was building throughout the city. And the Dresden certainly, I think, is his most notable building.
Yeah, a few years ago, maybe 2019. We did a bus tour of Wardman buildings, and we got to go into the Dresden.
Oh,
Thank you
nice.
to Sally Burke. And it was
Yeah.
amazing to see those apartments. It was incredible.
Mhm.
Let's see. Has anyone used your information in conjunction with data from the mapping segregation project? Or have you worked with them, I guess?
Yeah, I don't think we have worked
not.
with them.
No.
Yeah. But maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
it's
Prolog did.
We
amazing
certainly welcome
data.
them to,
Yeah.
yeah, they should certainly welcome them to come look at it. Yeah.
Mhm. Let's see. How did you deal with demolished buildings? How did you find out about them and track them down or track them?
Mostly it was
some
from
of it was
maps, and then it was also
maps,
from the
yeah.
survey.
Yeah.
So, we would have an address and we would hand volunteers a pack of, or a square of buildings to survey.
Mhm.
And then they would mark up if a building did not appear, and then we would check it on the maps again, a later map to see when it had been demolished.
Right. And I mean, we did have some access to newspaper research. The Evening Star had an index, has an index, but the index was, someone had gone through and actually indexed it. And so some of these buildings, we were able to find articles about them. Obviously now you just push some buttons and you find out, but it took a very long time. And also the Saturday Real Estate Gossip column. Every Saturday it was called the Saturday Real Estate Gossip column. And every Saturday they would have information, and it might tell us something about buildings that were being demolished as well as buildings being built.
Wow. I guess that kind of answers Jim's question a little bit. He was wondering what types, if any, of buildings were demolished to build many of these apartment buildings that you guys had surveyed. And was this mostly open land, older houses? So I guess that's the way to find that out, is through those resources. But,
Yeah, right. What was there before?
Yeah, I mean, I don't
think
know the answer exactly.
Yeah.
Some of them were, on squares that did have some sort of construction on them. And then the apartments took over, but I don't know specifically.
Right. I mean, things that were, it's sort of like the story of K Street, where there were individual residences and then they were demolished for commercial buildings. But there is in Foggy Bottom an apartment building that was built on the site of the residence of the architect, and also Harry Wardman's house was the site of Wardman Towers. He demolished his own house to build the towers. And both of them, the architects were responsible for demolishing the buildings that were there to build apartment buildings on the site. So that's the opposite of what you were talking about. But in terms of but later when they start demolishing them, it's a lot of the ones were the downtown ones where commercialization was coming in. It was more profitable to have office buildings. And certainly as we move into World War II, I mean, many buildings were taken over. And so there was, apartment buildings became offices. Where the National Trust was, the 1789, which is now, was 1785, but Massachusetts Avenue. But that building was taken over as offices. And so there was incentive for people to demolish older things and also to make buildings smaller. So they had more single occupancy apartments, one efficiencies, not grand luxurious apartment buildings. They were trying to house a lot of people in the city. So that was incentive to demolish and replace with something new, modern, and, more occupants.
Stacy wants to know, can you say any more about how you and your volunteers set up the database pre-Windows, pre-Microsoft Office, and pre-internet? I can't even conceive what it would have been like with a C prompt or whatever came before, Access, Excel, Google Forms, and the like.
All right, well,
every
compute. Well, so it was standalone. The computers were standalone. I mean, your computer database was on a computer and you would make copies onto your floppy disks. That was it. I mean, there was no interaction between, you couldn't have 10 people entering data at the same time. Only one person, Laura, could enter the data. So that was a very big difference. But and I don't know, no volunteers participated in that part of it. It was all Laura who did that. Yeah. Yeah, she, aged as she was in that room, the computer. We used to have computer rooms even back then. You would have your computer in a room that you would go into to use the computer, not at your desk. So, but it looks like, if you looked at the screen, it looks just like what you would see today if you had a survey form in front of you. You could make it look whatever you wanted, but it was very primitive in terms of there was no color. There was, one font. There were no, you had capital, and did you even have capital and lowercase? I'm not sure, page by page. Yeah, it's just very simple. It was very simple, but it was, do you remember what program it was that we used?
Yeah, I know,
was,
like the second or third generation was based on Access. I do remember that. But I don't remember what the original data, what program that was formed with.
Yeah, I think he actually devised it, like for Keller and Triangle, he devised his database. And then as other people were doing more commercial databases, we were able to transition into something that could handle more. Because I know there was one, I think it was called Foxfire or something, but that could not take enough buildings. It was too small, because Maryland tried to take our database because the state they actually did they took a version of our database and used it because they had wanted to use Foxfire, and they did it and entered 2,000 buildings, and it shut down. No one had actually looked to see how many buildings could it absorb. So there would be a limit to that. And we think of the internet now as infinite, but that's certainly not how we looked at what we were doing then. So, but one person, one computer, that was it. If you lost that, you were done. There was no cloud, nothing, no cloud. Oh my gosh.
Very stressful.
Yeah, very good question.
Yeah. So Anne wants to know, how resistant have owners been to having their buildings assigned a historic designation insofar as they may preclude future demolition of the property in order to build something bigger and more modern? That's a pretty big question as well.
Most of the ones that I showed, the owner is the one promoting the designation, because then they can take advantage of the rehabilitation tax credit. And so those are not controversial projects. They're actually owner-sponsored applications. And then the ones we did as a result of the multiple property document, a couple of them were already within a historic district. But for instance, the Kennedy Warren, they ultimately took advantage of the rehab tax credit as part of a much later renovation. But, I think that was such a no-brainer. I don't think they could have gotten away with demolishing that building. I think it was a very beloved building, and everyone supported that designation. And the same with the Cairo.
Yeah, I don't remember there being any kind of a outrage of those original buildings.
Yeah, no, I think they were all pretty well received.
Yeah.
And then the subsequent
confused
ones,
sometimes because they wouldn't
yeah.
I say they might have been confused because they didn't understand, wait, what, this building's important? And several of them were pretty much abandoned. The Lafayette had no occupants. The Harrison was
The
abandoned.
Jefferson, yeah.
The Jefferson, and the Jefferson still is they're working on the Harrison. It's now called the Canterbury, and the Lafayette I think is back and running, and the Jefferson is not. And I think it's mostly because of the owners of they have something else in mind that would incorporate it, but they haven't been able to pull it together. So, and a lot of them just continue to be apartment buildings just like they've been. So.
That's cool. Great question, Anne. Tongue twister. So Lisa says she's interested in how these buildings incorporated discrimination against Black and to a lesser degree Jewish people. I've heard lots of stories about Connecticut Avenue buildings, but would love to have it collected all in one place, similar to the mapping segregation DC site. If you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I
Well,
think,
Washington was a segregated city. I mean,
Mhm.
it was
Yeah.
a segregated city. That's unfortunately the absolute truth. So it was, and same thing with, I mean, my mother-in-law remembers wanting to look at an apartment at the Broadmoor when she was a young woman, and she was Jewish, and they wouldn't even show her an apartment building, an apartment in that unit. And, so she learned pretty as a young woman, she was off
and we
limits
should have
for
put
certain
that on
buildings.
as an additional research topic. We've been doing a lot in Silver Spring, sort of documenting racial covenants and in housing practices in Silver Spring. And so that's something I think really that could augment our historic context.
Yeah.
Yes, and religious and racial
Yeah.
covenants, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Let's see. So Sally asks, when was the Ashburn renamed the Dresden, and do you know why?
I do not.
We'll look into that, Sally, and we'll get back to you with that.
Because Sally might know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sally might know. Sally Burke. Sally, if you know, you can put it in the chat. I don't know. So Judy asks, is the Westchester, sorry, on the list?
We didn't designate the Westchester. We certainly surveyed the Westchester.
Right.
And that was like one of the,
Yeah.
then that started a whole dive into buildings that had very unusual shapes. In a way to provide
Oh, yeah,
light and
that's
air
true.
on all sides of buildings. So that was another whole different group of buildings that we started looking at.
Right.
Let's see. We have time for a couple more questions, just a few. Somebody asks, well, can you talk about apartment hotels? I believe the Kennedy Warren, among others, was promoted as such.
Well, that the idea of an apartment hotel was, I mean, in New York, and then in the early ones in Washington, they would not necessarily have kitchens, and that everyone would you would live in the apartment, but you would go to a communal eating, dining room, or there was a bachelor apartment that didn't have kitchens because bachelors, of course, couldn't cook, and so. I'm teasing, obviously, but so that idea was very popular in Washington in the early years, and then again, bachelor apartments and also apartments just for women, were separated. But the apartment hotel became, because Washington was so transient. So when you say it's an apartment hotel, these were furnished apartments essentially, and you could live there as long or as short as you wanted to live there. So we didn't spend a lot of time on what was the difference, because the same amenities were being provided whether you stayed there for a night or for 3 months or for a year, whatever, but they had amenities that regular apartments, conventional apartments, might not have.
Let's see. Well, Sally wrote in, I don't know when and why the Ashburn became the Dresden. This came as a surprise to me, but now we know that every Wardman apartment building had a British name. So,
Yeah.
there you go.
Right.
Thanks, Sally. Let's see. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. So Betsy wants to know, this is probably not in the scope of your work, but I have noticed many apartments built and advertised around 1910 to 1912 were noted as fireproof. Do you know what made them fireproof?
I
Well,
think a lot.
what happened is that they passed a regulation that buildings had to be fireproof. So what made them fireproof? Why don't you say, Laura, what you think?
Well, I think, it was exactly a response to some of the 1910 zoning that was requiring better fireproof construction. So, we don't see frame construction anymore, and we're looking at masonry and terracotta tile and the introduction of steel as means to prevent fire.
Right. So the construction material and also the surfaces of, you'll see many houses in DC that are stucco, and they really weren't built as stucco houses. Stucco was put on in an attempt to fireproof them. That was the idea. So, but it's an interesting topic that we did not go into great. Someone should look at that, the whole fireproofing issue. So
Yeah.
as I was told by someone at GSA once, we have fire resistance, nothing is fireproof. So,
Sure, that's a good point.
right. Exactly.
Yep. Okay, I think maybe one more question, just one more. So Nancy asks, can you talk more about discovering the first instance of apartment designs being replicated? How did you know that this was the first, and was it the first in DC or first anywhere?
Do you
Well, it took
remember,
us a
Laura?
while to figure out which was the first. And it was just, by our surveyors coming back in. And then when we started looking at maps, then we saw the twin buildings. And then amazingly, we saw triples and groups of 4 and groups of 5. So I think the Gladstone and Hayward are the first remaining in the district.
Right.
Wardman did Wardman Row on our street, which is across from the Hayward and Gladstone. And I think that's like 7 buildings in a row. And then K-Fritz did K-Fritz Row.
WARDMAN.
I know, I was trying to do it quickly. I think it's 7 buildings.
7, yeah.
But there were a lot of twin buildings in DC. So I think that the larger rows were a little bit more unusual. I'm not sure how prevalent that is in other locations.
Yeah.
I would think, it was really a response to the growing middle class and the need to build apartments quickly and affordably.
Right.
And so you just duplicated design on the same lot. So
Right.
Makes
you
sense.
see a lot of them in
the same
city.
idea as everything. You build, you design one building and you just built it again and again and again. There's a cost efficiency that we may sometimes not like, but is certainly something that developers have used in the past. So,
All right. Well, I think we're about to wrap up, but I just want to thank you both again so much for taking the time to speak with us today, and just for the incredible amount of work that you all did to put this amazing resource together. Zach had put a link to Traceries website as well as like the survey into the chat, but also in a follow-up email, I'll include those as well. In case people missed that. But is there anything that you'd like to share? Anything else about Traceries? I know you guys are on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, and people can follow you there. But if there's anything else you wanted to plug, I guess.
No, this was great.
Yeah,
This
we
was
try
fun
to,
talking about.
it's great. It's really, this was, it really was a very critical moment in Traceries history, because it was such a wide range of things, and we use that information every day today. We still use it, and the things we learned about how to develop a database, and we have done databases. We're about to do a database out in Michigan for,
wow.
that it's because it's such a great model. So it's really very exciting to be able to have something that worked out. I will say my grandfather told me about computers when I was a little girl. I had no idea what he was talking about. And I always wish he lived a little bit longer so he could see the world of the computer, actually really be like this. This is incredible today. So we're happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And I encourage everybody to take a look at the survey. So thank you all so much for being here, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.